Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Baker. I'm the technical consultant for Fenestration Canada. I want to welcome you to the Fenestration Canada webinar, Accelerating the Adoption of High-Performance Residential Windows in Canada by 2013. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Debbie Scharf is the Director of the Equipment Division of the Office of Energy Efficiency at Natural Resources Canada. She is responsible for overseeing the government's Energy Efficiency Standards Development Program, EnerGuide Labeling Program, and the Energy Star program as it pertains to equipment and appliances. Debbie has 15 years experience in managing and leading regulatory and strategic initiatives within the Government of Canada. Prior to joining Natural Resources Canada in 2014, she worked with Environment Canada, where she was involved in various files, including the Chemical Management Program and the Clean Air Agenda. She has also developed industrial regulations for greenhouse gas emissions and crafted strategies for managing the risks associated with chemical substances. She holds a master's degree in environmental management from Simon Fraser University and a Bachelor of Commerce from McGill University. Welcome, Debbie, and thank you for being here with us today.
Hey, Jeff, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Debbie.
Wonderful. My voice is coming through clearly?
Very clearly.
Okay, excellent. So I just have one very quick housekeeping question because I understand that everyone's line is muted. Jeff, are we going to take questions as we go, or am I going to run through the presentation?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Debbie. There is a question chat window there. I'm monitoring the questions coming in. So anybody that's got questions, if you would go into the questions window and submit the question by text, I will be monitoring those. And if we've got questions, Debbie, that are relevant to the middle of the presentation, I'll interrupt you and let you know. If not, we'll typically leave them to the end.
Fantastic. And I'll try and take some pauses along the way to give you a chance to jump in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Debbie.
So let's just move to the next slide, please. So I wanted to go briefly over the objectives for today's presentation. The first thing I wanted to do was to provide you with an overview of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And then I wanted to share with you our federal, provincial, territorial aspirational goals for energy performance around residential windows and some feedback we've received from recent workshops that we've had as we work on our market transformation agenda in this product category. And then I wanted to end by providing you with an overview of some of the more immediate activities around Energy Star and regulated energy efficiency standards for windows that we're engaged in at this period in time. So we'll just move to the next slide, please. Great. So I think the slides are taking just a second to catch up here. So I wanted to just spend a couple minutes setting the context for you. So the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which from now on I'll just call the PCF because it's a very long title, it was actually adopted by First Ministers. We're going back quite a ways now to December 2016. And what made it fairly seminal in nature is that it was the first time that we had a true pan-Canadian approach for how to meet climate change commitments. In this particular case, our commitments to 2030. But it also really set the stage for our longer-term transition to a low-carbon economy. And in this Pan-Canadian framework, there's a number of sectors that are covered, a number of pillars. You've probably heard about the carbon pricing regime as one very good example. But in there's actually what we call the building strategy. And this is the part of the Pan-Canadian framework that focuses on residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. And the reason why it got its own strategy in here is because this sector represents 17% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So it is a very substantive sector from a climate change perspective. So this strategy has 4 key pillars to it, and they're listed here on the slide, and I'm just going to spend a minute going through each one as part of the contextual overview. The first one is around net zero energy ready codes for new buildings. So the idea here is that we would be developing at the federal level model building codes in a tiered format that ultimately would lead to a code that would be net zero energy ready, and that these would be available for adoption by provinces and territories with the goal that by 2030, all provinces and territories have adopted the code into their law at the net zero energy ready level. Underpinning that is actually a fairly strong research, development, and demonstration effort on looking at high-performance building components and ways to lower construction costs, because this is a pretty important part of getting those costs down. And so there is a separate program being run around research and development to help support that in the years to come. The second pillar of the building strategy is around an energy code for existing buildings. So 75% of the buildings that are standing in 2030 are already here. And so if we want to make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and energy use in the sector, we can't just tackle new construction. We also have to be looking at the buildings that are already standing. The idea is to develop a type of energy code that could be used when significant modifications or renovations are being made to existing buildings. Now, this is fairly new in Canada, although not necessarily elsewhere in the world. So it's going to take us a little bit of time to figure out how exactly it's going to work. But the idea is to develop a model code at the federal level, which could then be used by provinces and territories in adopting it into their laws. The third pillar is around labeling and disclosure of energy use in buildings. And this is the idea, the goal here is really to make mandatory labeling and disclosure of energy use a reality across Canada, and that approach be harmonized, so it is a consistent regime everywhere. The idea here is you can't manage what you can't measure, and so it's really about providing information to homeowners, building owners, and consumers around the energy use in those structures so that they could then be better managed. The last pillar is around energy efficiency in equipment and appliances, and I'm actually going to ask you to hop over to the next slide because this is where I really want to focus the rest of the presentation. And so to introduce you to what is spoken about in the Pan-Canadian framework around appliances and equipment is there's actually a commitment in the PCF to set standards for heating equipment and other key technologies to the highest levels economically and technically achievable. And this is in addition to the continued federal programs that we have around things like Energy Star, which I know your sector is very familiar with, as well as our regulations that set minimum performance standards for equipment. And the reason why there's a flag in there around heating equipment and other key technologies is because at the end of the day, energy use in this sector is really predominantly driven by heating. So we're going to be looking at that very carefully, and I'm going to get into this in the rest of the presentation. But the only thing I'll add here is that we have a fairly ambitious agenda around our energy efficiency standards. So our regulations are being updated in the next few years to have up to 60 new standards for products that are already regulated or will be added to regulation. And so we're talking about windows today, but our agenda around regulations and Energy Star actually covers a much broader range of products. We'll move to the next slide. Great. So this is where I really want to delve into our market transformation efforts as it pertains to windows. So in the context of developing our Pan-Canadian framework, federal, provincial, and territorial governments really looked at where do we need to focus our efforts if we want to make significant transformative change in the building sector. And we landed in 3 different product areas that we thought can make a substantial difference. Those are space heating, water heating, and windows. And like I said, heating is a pretty important energy use area in the building sector. 64 to 83%, in fact, of energy use in existing buildings comes from heating. And we also know that the next generation set of technologies can make a big difference in terms of how much energy use can be saved in a home. For next generation space and water heating technologies, it could be up to 35% reduction in home energy use. And for windows, you could see a significant improvement in heating and cooling loads if you really account for an improved envelope. And so the 3 levels of government got together and prioritized action in these 3 product categories. And then in 2017, we released what we call our market transformation strategies. And these were released but we call them EMMC ministers, but these are really the energy ministers at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. So we laid out these market transformation strategies, and what they essentially did was they laid out a series of aspirational goals, and I'll run through those for Windows, but a series of aspirational goals for energy performance in the short, medium, and long term in each of these three product categories. And then it also laid out the barriers that we believe are in the marketplace to achieving those goals in the long run. And all of that information was collected through a series of workshops, and we had a number of representatives from the Windows industry at a workshop with us in March 2017, where we shared those goals, and we talked about what are those barriers, and what are the kinds of measures, generically, but what are the kinds of things that we could be doing to overcome those barriers. And all of that fed into these market transformation strategies that were released in August of 2017. And in those strategies, we signaled that the next step would be to develop a roadmap to be able to get there. And I'm going to walk you through the road mapping process, but before I get there, I want to explain to you what are the aspirational goals for residential windows and why we chose them. So let's move to the next slide. So the aspirational goals. So you may be wondering, you're looking at the slide, I'm going to walk through line by line and explain it to you, but I just want to start by clarifying what are these aspirational goals. So the first thing that I'll say is they're agreed to by federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and they are very ambitious, especially in the long term, but we think that they are achievable given the technologies that are emerging into the marketplace and given where the market is today. We feel that they are in line with the level of ambition in the Pan-Canadian Framework for Codes and Standards, and that these are important steps to transition to our low-carbon future. And they are framed as performance levels that could be regulated. For those of you that are familiar with the Energy Star program, you've seen these types of performance metrics. I mean, you certainly know your business, but this is a little bit the way our Energy Star specifications are also framed. So they are framed as performance levels. But what I will say is that they are not a commitment to regulate at exactly that period of time, but they're really designed to be directional in nature so that all of the market is working towards a common outcome. And they are allowing us a very structured way to frame the barriers in the marketplace and to identify them, organize them, and talk about how they could be overcome. And so now I'm going to walk you through them, and then that's when I'm going to pause, and I'm going to let Jeff tell me if there's any questions. So these are divided up by short, medium, and long term, 2020, 2025, and 2030. And these were done in 5-year increments, largely for simplicity perspective. So in 2020, the idea is that residential windows for sale in Canada meet an average U factor of 1.6 or an ER of 25, and we've put it in imperial units for those of you who may work with imperial units in your business. And by and large, these are performance levels that are very achievable given where the market is today. By 2025, taking a step up, that all residential windows for sale in Canada will meet a U factor of 1.2 or an ER of 34. And this is in line where our current Energy Star specification for Zone 3 is. I'm going to skip over the next sub-bullet for a moment just so I could finish my train of thought. By 2030, all residential windows for sale in Canada meet a U factor of 0.8, approximately an ER of 40, just because we need to make sure that the link between the two is accurate. But we think it's around an ER of 40. And so you see a sequential increase in the stringency of those performance levels. I will take a step back to that bullet that I skipped in 2025, and it says residential windows with a U factor of 0.8 can be manufactured and installed cost effectively. And really, this isn't a performance target in the same way of the other targets. This is really a research and development target. I have spoken to your industry a lot over the last year. I've made a number of presentations, and we all know that reaching a U factor of 0.8 is extremely challenging. And there's a lot of work to be done to get there. And I'll speak to some of that in the next couple slides. So this is really a research development type of target where we know that for windows at that performance level, there may be a whole lot more work that needs to be done, even at the earlier stages of product development, And we wanted to make sure that these aspirational goals included everything from R&D to market stimulation all the way to a standard at the end of the day. And we recognized that we needed to put a flag in these aspirational goals, that work was going to need to be done on a window at that performance level if we wanted to see that 2030 goal be achievable. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. Jeff, are you getting any questions?
Debbie, I've got two questions. The first one is a statement that they had heard that the 2020 goal may get pushed out to 2022. Is that correct?
Yes. So the 2020 goal we may not make the 2020 timeframe. And in fact, I'm going to have a slide that's going to talk a little bit about our regulations, and I'm going to lay out a bit of the process for you there. And I think that'll give you a bit of a flavor of how that's going to play out over time. But that 2020 may slip because of the time frame that we need to allocate for consultation and regulatory development. But if you'll permit me probably 5 or 10 minutes when we get to that slide, I'm going to give you some more detail.
You can tell, maybe it's the same answer, Debbie. If we could back up one slide,
yep.
To slide 4.
Yeah.
It's a 2030/35 on the bottom of that slide. Yeah. Is that going to show up in the same? It's the same question basically.
Yeah. So for the space and water heating goals, they actually run out to 2035. And because that was a generic slide that covered all 3 products, we put 2030/2035 because the long-term goal for space and water heating is a 2035 timeframe, and the long-term goal for Windows is a 2030 timeframe. Perfect. So no, that 2035 is not relevant to Windows. Good.
That's just for clarity. That's great. Okay, that's. Hang on. I've had some more questions just pop up. Will today's presentation be made available is a general question. I believe the answer to that, yes, and the recording will also be made available.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Question on. Let me save the other 2 till later, Debbie. They'll. I'm sure you're going to cover them. So if you don't, I'll come back to them. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to keep going.
Go ahead.
Great. So let's move to the next slide. So on this slide, we have what we call our market transformation scorecard. And this little graphic with the red, the yellow, and the green dots was actually, it's pulled out of that market transformation strategies report that we published in August of 2017. So this is a list of the barriers that we heard from stakeholders in the workshop we held early in 2017. These were the barriers identified to meeting the 3 levels of aspirational goals. And what I will say before I just jump into the barriers is that chart is framed around what we like to call the 5 A's. The 5 A's is just a really simplified approach to how we could look at barriers in the marketplace. And they are as follows. Availability. Does the technology exist? Accessibility. Does the market have access to the technology? Awareness. Does the market know about the technology? Affordability. Is the technology affordable? And acceptance. Is the form, fit, and function of the technology acceptable to the end user? And the idea is that if you answer no to any of these questions, or even to some extent, you probably still have a barrier in the marketplace that you need to address before you could see that technology fully deployed. And so we walked through this methodology with the stakeholders last year, and based on what we heard, we notionally assigned these green, yellow, and red dots. It's not a perfect science, but the idea was to have an easy to look at dashboard or scorecard of where we are today. And so in terms of the barriers that we heard from your industry and other stakeholders associated with your industry, was for a U factor of 0.6, that we didn't actually hear that there were any barriers around these 5 A's, but we did hear very strongly that there needs to be consistent labeling and certification. And this was really what I understood it to mean was confidence that everybody's following the same rules and that somebody's checking to make sure that everybody is following the same rules, and that didn't yet exist in Canada. And when I talk about regulations a little bit later, you'll see how regulations can actually help with that. In terms of a U factor of 0.2, so now we're getting to our 2025 aspirational goals, we heard that there were still some challenges in terms of installation, weight, and upfront cost. And then for a U factor of 0.8, Not surprising, a lot of barriers and challenges still in the marketplace around availability of the models, affordability, whether or not they can be designed light enough and can be manufactured easily. Barriers were raised around the absence of standardized testing procedures for emerging technologies, the low knowledge in the marketplace of Windows at those performance levels, the upfront cost, and consumer acceptance if there's real changes to form or function, with a question of whether or not all types of Windows could be made at that performance level. And certainly comfort if it causes overheating, depending on how you choose the window for the application. So you'll see that that row has a lot of yellow and red dots, whereas the shorter term goals have a lot more green dots. So we know we have a bunch of work to do. Next slide. So as I said, in the market transformation strategies document, we had the scorecard, we had all the barriers written down, and then there was a signal that we would be developing a roadmap. And a roadmap is pretty straightforward. The idea, it's not straightforward in terms of what needs to be done to get there, but it's straightforward as a concept, which is to lay out the concrete measures to address the barriers identified to achieving the aspirational goals. But for us, it was very important that this roadmap be a government stakeholder roadmap for Canada, and that it would be based on input from stakeholders, and that stakeholders should feel that they have buy-in and ownership over it. So it wouldn't just be a government plan that we would go away and just do on our own, but it would actually be something that we would build together and implement together. And that in this roadmap, we would be clear about what are the roles of the different players in the marketplace, what are the priority activities for both research and development, for that cost and performance target, and market deployment, our 5 A's, what would be the highest priority activities that we need to engage in, what would be the timing for those initiatives, and then how are we going to know if we're making progress? How do we know when those red dots become yellow dots and those yellow dots become green dots? And that all of these items would be inside the roadmap, clearly identified. As I said, it would be a joint plan, and it's also being complemented by a national market study, which is almost all the way there, but partially there, that would help us provide some information along the way. So the idea is that these roadmaps are going to be delivered to our energy ministers at all 3 levels of government this summer and endorsed and published in August of this year. So in terms of developing this roadmap, I've said I think a couple times now that this roadmap is jointly being developed with our stakeholders and your industry from a Windows perspective. So the process that we've been following to do that is, again, it's through a series of workshops, only because that's the easiest way to engage a big group of people all at the same time. So we held a workshop, an all-day workshop at the end of October, early November, that was strictly around research and development priorities. And then we had another workshop just this past February on market deployment priorities. And I am now, in the next 2 slides, going to walk you through what we heard in those workshops. I'm just wondering, Jeff, I'm going to pause for a minute and ask you if you have any more questions on the process.
Nothing more on the process yet.
Great. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So our R&D workshop, so as I mentioned, it was last fall. There were about 25 participants from university researchers, national labs, manufacturers, associations, and we were really focusing on the long-term goal, on how can we get to this pathway of having a U-factor 0.8 window be cost-effective. There were 32 unique R&D activities or technology suggestions that were made in the series of breakout group discussions. And then there was a prioritization exercise where everyone got to vote on those R&D suggestions or activities, and 12 of those items came out as high. I didn't list all 12 here, but what I can say is there are workshop reports from both the R&D workshop and the market deployment workshop, which has the list of all 32 activities from an R&D perspective, as well as the ranking from the voting. And that is, I'm more than welcome to make that available to anyone who wants to see that. So it's all I've done is put up here the top 4 that was prioritized as the highest. And they were the study of U-factor versus solar heat gain, trade-offs and attributes of each rating. And I'm sure at some point someone will ask me a question about that, but that has been sort of an overwhelming question that many manufacturers have asked about, in particular as you get to higher or lower U-factor levels and the trade-offs between the two different metrics. So definitely a lot of interest in understanding that and understanding the performance paths moving forward. Secondly, R&D into thin triples with low E coatings, including the durability of the glass, a study of window configurations and integration with wall panels, in particular around high-performance construction and high-performance walls, and improved designs to reduce thermal bridging and understanding edge performance. So these were identified, but what I can say overall in terms of my observations from that workshop is the good news is there was a pretty high degree of consensus on the priorities for the R&D activities. These 4 got ranked very high, and then a whole bunch almost got no votes at all. And so there really was a high degree of consensus, which was good to see from the industry. The priorities were focusing mainly on insulating technology, and this is a lot of where we see R&D money in the United States going, so there's some consistency there. There was less of a focus on dynamic windows and PV generation, and admittedly that could be because there wasn't a large representation of people who were interested in that area at the workshop, and so we're not forgetting about it, but there was less focus there. So that was the R&D workshop. I'm just going to run through the market deployment workshop, and then I'll stop and see if there's any questions. So next slide. Great. So the market deployment workshops happened just in early February, a larger group, more than 50 participants, and this was a little bit of a different audience because we were looking at more of the 2025 goal. So we had still manufacturers and associations there, but we had home builders and utilities. We've had some representation from the codes process, and so a broader range of stakeholders in the economy. And we had 36 unique deployment activities with 13 prioritized as high. And I can say that once again, there was a high degree of consensus on the prioritization of the deployment activities. And the top 4 were around having a simplified source of information and benefits of products and available programs, including regional differences. So this would be sort of a bit consumer focused. Providing sustainable tax rebate for installations, mandatory disclosure of energy and GHG performance upon the sale of homes, and installer training certification programs. What I can say from my experience at the workshop was apart from there being a high degree of consensus, there was a lot of discussion around how to talk to consumers about the multiple benefits of high performance windows in recognition that price is a factor, but there are a lot of other reasons why having a high performance window is a good thing. And how do we talk to consumers about those other non-energy benefits like comfort, which came up quite a bit. And then again, the ER versus U-factor issues, a lot of people saying we really do need to resolve that in the long run and know what the path forward is on that. So, questions? Jeff?
Well, one of the questions is directly related to the U-factor ER, are you considering removing ER or energy rating, or moving forward with a path with both? And has there been any decisions made, I think is the question.
So no decisions have been made. And I'm just checking in my notes here if I actually wrote them down. I think I wrote somewhere in my notes, I hope to get to it, some of the things to think about a little bit as we move forward with that. In the regulatory context, I will talk about how we're going to have that conversation. So bear with me a couple more slides if you can do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're taking all of this information that we collected from these different workshops, and we're starting to build the roadmap right now. We don't have a lot of time. We only have until June. So if we add up the months, it's about 3. But there is a lot of information that we do have. Industry has been fantastic at providing a lot of clarity around the things that they're concerned about, the things that they think need to be done. And so it's been really wonderful to engage with your industry on that. So we agreed, though, that it would not be a very good approach for the government to sort of go away, write these roadmaps, and for them to miraculously appear in August. And so what we've decided to do is we put what we call an advisory task group together. And this is going to be about 15 or 16 folks from industry covering space heating, water heating, and windows that are going to work with us as we build the roadmap over the course of the next 3 months. So Fenestration Canada is represented on the advisory group, as is the Insulating Glass Manufacturers Alliance, as well as a couple other representatives from the windows industry. So I think we have about 4 or 5 people representing your industry. And the idea is to continue to seek feedback as we lay over on top of all the information we receive from industry, now government's perspectives and priorities, and merge the two together and build the roadmap. And so we are continuing to move with our stakeholder groups, and they'll have an opportunity to comment on the ultimate prioritization that we do as we add the government lens, as well as comment on the draft roadmap itself, and we'll have an opportunity to bring that feedback in. So there still is going to be your industry represented as we build the roadmaps, and I'm particularly grateful to FenCan and IGMA for agreeing to participate, as well as a couple other windows manufacturers. So we're going to stop now on the roadmap piece, because I want to get into the more immediate activities that we're engaging in as the roadmap is being developed. And this is where I'm going to talk about regulations, and I'm going to talk about Energy Star, and we could pick up on the threads of some of the questions that I've been asked. So in our Market Transformation Strategies Report of 2017, we did signal that the government is going to consider adding residential windows to federal regulations. Some of you may be aware of how these regulations work if you operate in BC or in Ontario, or if you sell into BC or Ontario, because they have very similar regulations that already exist in those provinces. But now we're talking about bringing them into federal regulations, and that we're also going to consider Energy Star performance levels that align with our aspirational goals. So I'm first going to give you, I'm going to say like the highest level 101 into regulations that I can, and then help give you a sense of how we're going to play out in the regulatory context, and then I'll tell you a bit about what's happening on Energy Star second. So adding windows to Canada's federal energy efficiency regulations would do a few things. So the first thing that it's going to do is it would establish minimum performance standards for the way a window is manufactured. And this is where you're going to get into the ERU factor discussion. It would also mandate a testing standard. It would mandate certification requirements against those tests, and labeling and reporting requirements. This is consistent across every single product that is regulated. So this is what the regulations do. It would not be unique to the windows industry. These requirements would be nationally consistent, which means they would apply everywhere in Canada. Having said that, though, I do want to make a little bit of a distinction, and it is a bit confusing and sometimes hard to get your head around, so I'm happy to explain it a couple times if I need to. Federal regulations only apply in certain cases. They apply to products that cross boundaries. And that boundary could be an international boundary, or it could be a provincial boundary. And that has to do with the way constitutional authorities have been divvied up in our Constitution, and the powers that the federal government have versus provinces and territories. So that would mean that our regulations at the federal level would only apply to windows that are manufactured either outside of Canada and brought into Canada, or manufactured in one province and then shipped to another province to be sold. They would not apply to products that are both made and sold in the same province. But that is why we have provincial regulations. There are a number of provinces in Canada that regulate exactly the same way as the federal regulations. Ontario and BC are the two provinces that are doing it right now. Provincial regulations cover the sales of everything within their borders, regardless of where it's made. And that is how federal and provincial regulations work together. And the idea is that we would be building a nationally consistent approach at both the federal and provincial level. So that is how the regulations work. I feel like I missed one point, but it's escaped me, so it'll probably come back to me in just a minute. So when we talked about timing, someone asked about 2020, 2022. So I do want to explain to you how the process works to develop a federal regulation. We have a lot of consultation that goes around building a federal regulation, because we want to make sure that what we put in place is responsible and is based on analytics and input from stakeholders. And so typically the process that we follow is we have a period of time in which we are almost informally consulting with the industry, and that's what's going to happen over the course of the next year. This happens in a variety of different ways. It could start with a discussion paper where we would be laying out what our proposed regulatory requirements would be and seek feedback. We also use things called technical bulletins, which we have lots available online for other products that you could have a look at, which lay out in as clearly as possible what would be the technical requirements that would be in a regulation. And we take the time to consult on those. We seek feedback, and only once all of that feedback is received do we assess it, and then do we start writing regulations. At this point in time, we have not officially started these informal consultations. And so I want no one to be worried that there's going to be a regulation that's going to appear in the next year. That's not going to happen. We're going to have a period of probably about a year where we're going to be working with you in this informal consultation stage. And once we've pretty much sorted out with the industry, by and large, what we propose in the regulations, only then will we move to the stage where we actually write the regulations. And then those regulations will be published, and you'll actually get a chance to see them, read them, and comment on them. And there's typically a 75-day formal process in which that happens. And then we'll assess that feedback one more time, and only after that will the regulations be final. And that's why this process can usually take between 2 and 3 years at the outset, but it can take a couple of years. And we really want to get this right. So while I still have my eye on 2020, I think it will take a little bit longer than that to finish the regulatory design. And so that timeline may slip. So you are right, we have spoken as late as 2022, but the idea is we want to take the time to put the right regulation in place for the industry and make sure that the industry is prepared for it. So I think I'm going to stop there on the regulations and ask if there are any questions. Jeff, was I that crystal clear?
I'm just trying to sort through them now, Debbie.
Okay.
One of the questions on the regulation that came up is, will the federal laws force the provincial regulations into alignment to ensure that windows being sold in the same province match the federal regulation? Great
question. So we can't force. For those of you that are familiar with the U.S. system, the federal government actually preempts the states. That doesn't work in Canada because of our constitution. But what I can say is that we're working very closely with our provincial colleagues, and our intent is to build a harmonized system together. And while I know for industry it is hard to see when governments are talking to each other, I can say that this is one area where we're going to be building the regulatory design together. And that is enormously important, not just from a harmonization perspective, but from a coverage of regulatory system perspective. We want to make sure that there's the greatest coverage, and given that federal regulations don't apply to everything, we need to be in sync with the provincial regulations as well. So we are working very closely behind the scenes with our provincial counterparts on this.
Okay, another question I need to paraphrase is: has the government done work on the costs of these products and the payback and what's involved in all the costs of the?
Yep, great question.
Yeah.
Yep. So for every standard that we put in place in regulations, we do an economic analysis. We look at upfront costs associated from moving to whatever is the predominant technology in the marketplace to what we would be mandating in a regulation, and what would be the energy savings and other benefits associated with the proposed standard or the proposed regulation. So that has not happened yet in this case. However, when I said that we are doing a market study, part of that is to start to collect that information. And maybe now, even though I was going to plug it at the end, I will make the plug that there is a survey going out. And I believe Fenestration Canada is going to help us out with getting that survey out and into people's email boxes. Please complete the survey. we can only do an analysis based on the information that we have. And this is an opportunity to help us have the most robust information to understand where the market is today so that we can do a really good economic analysis of the impacts of these proposed standards. But we can only use the information that we have. So we really do rely on the industry to help us along with that. So this is my plug that you will be getting that survey coming soon. And I please encourage you to fill it out with the expertise that you have from your individual companies.
And
but
Debbie,
yes,
Debbie, I'll speak to that as well. Fenestration Canada will be helping out with this, and a major push to get as many of our members to participate in the survey, because as you say, you want to hear their voices. We want to get as many voices into that survey as possible. So we will be working on that, and that FenCan does have a task group of members working with you on this to provide feedback as well.
Correct. Yeah. Other questions?
I'm just trying to catch up and read them here. Okay, question is, will the regulation make it illegal for a manufacturer to sell products that are lower than the U factor regulated at the time of sale?
Are they worried about sort of inventory versus time of sale? Do you think that's what the question's about, Jeff?
Possibly.
Okay. So at the point in which the product crosses a provincial or international boundary, it needs to meet the standard. But once, I know it's a bit tougher for windows. I don't want to say once it's in a store because they don't necessarily appear in a store, but it applies to the point of manufacture. It does not manufacture and importation. But if you were, I'm going to draw the analogy to a refrigerator just to make life a bit easier. If you were a refrigerator that was on the floor of Home Depot and you were there already, you needed to meet the standard at the point in time in which you were made, not the point in time in which you were sold. That's probably the easiest way that I can say it.
Yeah, and I think that helps, yes.
Yeah, it's a bit trickier for windows because I know you're made to order, so it's a little bit trickier, but
okay. Debbie, I've got a couple of specific questions on enforcement. Are you going to address that, or you want me to ask them now?
Yeah, go ahead and ask.
Okay, so one, I think they're very similar here. One was, will building officials be educated, and then what other enforcement efforts will be made?
Okay. So then that's a great question, and I know that the industry is really interested in this particular question. We take enforcement very seriously. I know that the provinces in their energy efficiency regulations also take this very seriously, but I also know the industry is used to working in a building code context. So what I can say is we do maintain in both federal and provincial regulations a pre-market certification system through third-party verification. For those of you that work with Energy Star, it is a similar approach. But we also do post-market compliance activities. I know for windows, it is a very complicated sector. It's not like making refrigerators, and I fully appreciate that. And so this year, while we're engaged in our informal consultations on regulatory design, we're also going to be working with our provincial colleagues on building a compliance strategy around windows specifically, because we know the industry is quite different from many of the other products we regulate, like light bulbs and furnaces and refrigerators. But the idea is it will likely be a multi-pronged approach. I can't speak to it in any degree of detail right now because we're just starting those conversations, but we're going to have to make use of a number of different levers to ensure compliance with the regulations, which will go from education, which is a super important part of compliance promotion, all the way to post-market verification and independent testing by the government.
Okay, and I think, Debbie, that this is a somewhat related question in that you just commented. The question about will this be implemented in building codes like the BC Building Code? And I think if we go back to the beginning, there's a parallel effort on building codes.
Yeah, in terms of enforcement.
Yeah. Well, and not just enforcement, but the values of the regulation. Will the regulation and building codes be lined up?
Oh, you mean will the performance levels be standardized?
Performance levels, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question, and it's one that I think about a lot for many different products, not just for windows. On HVAC systems, we think about that a lot. So our goal through our market transformation work is to be very clear about what performance levels we'd like to move to so that we can try and harmonize that to the maximum extent that we can with building codes. They are also a different process. Every province adopts them separately. But what I can say is that I think the path to success is for us to be ahead. And then the building codes to look and say, well, it makes no sense really to be different. And that's the strategy that I'm using. I am presenting to the National Building Codes Committees. For those of you who may not be aware, there's now going to be a standing committee on energy efficiency in residential buildings that's being merged with commercial buildings. At the national level, I've already presented at that level our market transformation work. I will be doing that again, and I am trying to urge them to ensure either alignment with the federal regulations, to really ensure alignment with the federal regulations, because misaligned standards is not the path to success here. So that's what I am doing personally. It is on my work plan, and it won't be forgotten.
Okay, another question is on installation. How do you propose to regulate or control installation, as a good window installed poorly will not achieve the goals?
Yes. That's a great question. So the regulations themselves don't deal with installation. Installation in new construction, installation is probably better suited for building codes. And this is a really interesting intersection between minimum energy performance standards and building codes, is that there's a lot of different ways to get at improving energy performance, and the regulations are only one lever. But there are a number of other levers in the economy that deal with other aspects of the energy performance equation. And so we need to find a way to line those levers up so that each one that's best placed to act is tackling the right issues. And so I do care about installation. The regulations can't say how something has to be installed, but I think that that's work that we can continue to press on. Even if it doesn't find its way into a federal regulation, it could find its way into another lever.
Okay, one more question here, Debbie, it's somewhat related. If I own a house which complies with it says the regulation, but then based on current NBC 2010 of a 1.6 U factor, and I try to sell my house in 2025, how will this affect my house? Would I have to comply with the 2025 regulation?
Whatever windows are in your house from a federal energy efficiency standards perspective, what's in your house is not the point of regulation. The point of regulation, it's when it's made and sold. Okay. So once it's installed, you would not see these regulations impact that. Now, if that homeowner decided, I want to change my windows and put in new windows, the windows that homeowner would have available to them would meet the standard of the day.
Right. Now, on one of the other pillars that you talked about in one of your opening slides, the possibility of energy labeling of houses. Yeah. It could come in, and I'm going to say that's a completely different topic that I think FenCan might be looking for somebody to speak on and talk about where that may lead. Yeah. And that's where a labeling program on your house could have an implication if you tried to sell your house.
Yeah, and you're right. That is an issue outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. But it is an ecosystem of improving energy efficiency in the building sector. And I could certainly, my colleague in the housing division has a lot of experience with the EnerGuide label, and I'm sure that she'd be happy to make a presentation on how it works and how it could work in the future.
I think maybe we'll add that to a list of topics that we'll have in a future webinar.
Perfect.
Great. I think I've got through all the current questions now, Debbie. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so we're going to go to the next slide, which is Energy Star. We've got about 10 minutes left, but this is the last slide before I go to next steps. So I want to talk a little bit about the Energy Star program. I don't know how much the industry is sort of up to speed as we're developing our new specification. Just wanted to make sure that we got the message out there. The Energy Star specification for residential windows, we maintain that in my group as well. It's updated typically every 5 years. The last update was in 2015, so the next update is coming in 2020. And we are looking to align the specification with our market transformation goals. And so we have done a lot of work into looking about how to structure the specification. but we've now released a discussion paper, and the main changes under consideration, I'm giving you the high level sort of performance metrics pieces, is number one, we're considering having performance levels apply nationally to one zone as opposed to the 3 that we have today. And that for windows and sliding glass doors, we'd be looking at a U factor of 1.2 or an ER of 34. And this is, of course, in line with our 2025 aspirational goal. However, there's going to be a minimum ER requirement on the U factor compliance path and a maximum U factor requirement on the ER compliance path. And this has to do with some of the discussions around the U factor and the ER and addressing some of the concerns in new construction around overheating concerns. So trying to really find the balance around these 2 compliance paths. And this is what we're putting on the table right now that we feel provides that balance depending on the performance path that you choose. It's also covering, of course, hinge doors, side lights and transoms, and skylights to those performance levels. There is a discussion paper that was just released. Everyone has until the end of March, I believe it is, which is this week. It went out a couple weeks ago to provide comments. The draft specification would come out very quickly after that because we really want the final specification done by the end of April to give industry as much time as possible to adapt to a January 2020 new specification. And so I know that we could probably talk at length about the performance metrics, the U factor, the ER, and we won't have enough time to get into a really in-depth discussion about it. What I can say is, though, in trying to design this Energy Star specification for 2020, we've been doing a lot of work in thinking about the 2 different performance metrics. And you know, Energy Star will maintain the 2 different performance paths. ER with a solar heat gain does have benefits. We know that those benefits are there. We did do an energy analysis around these different performance levels for Energy Star in particular. As we move into a regulatory context, though, we're going to have this discussion again. So I don't want to have it on the phone now in this webinar, but what I will say is that the first step in our regulatory informal consultations is going to be to release a discussion paper. And for the federal government, discussion papers are helpful because what they do is it's going to sort of explain how the regulation works again. I gave you a very, very high level 101 today on it, but it's going to do that again where it's going to explain how the regulation works and how the compliance system works. And then it's going to lay out a number of issues around the regulatory design. It's going to include things like the performance metric, the tiers of performance levels and when they may come into effect, how labeling could work, so all the different pieces of the regulation. And then it's going to give the industry an opportunity to look at it and then tell us what they think about it. And that's where we'll probably engage in some conversations, but the discussion paper is going to at least help frame the issues that we need to talk about. And so I see that conversation happening through the middle of 2018, and I hope that discussion paper is going to come out later this spring. It's going to be informed by the survey that's coming to your inbox soon, so we got to finish that piece of work so that we could be able to characterize the market a little bit better, and then we can finish drafting this discussion paper. So we will return to you on this issue of the U factor and the solar heat gain component in that discussion paper and start to talk much more specifically about how it should work in a regulatory context, because regulations, you really have to think about flexibility versus burden, and there's a lot that we could talk about around that. So I will take like a question or two, recognizing we only have 5 minutes, but this is a conversation that will take a little bit of time. So Jeff, anything jumping up that you want me to talk about right now?
No, we're caught up on questions. If you've got questions, please type them in. Okay,
great. Okay, so I urge you to get in any comments on the discussion paper this week so that we can finish the specification. And if we move to the last slide, I'll just talk about next steps very quickly. So from a market transformation question, we have already shared the summaries of the R&D and market deployment workshops to Fenestration Canada. Happy if you don't have them on hand, just send them to you again if you want to share them along with this presentation to those on this webinar. completing the national market study. We're hoping that that will be done by the end of April. It might slip a little bit into May, depending on how quickly we get the survey answers back and we're able to move through them and draw the conclusions from them. We're going to be submitting our roadmaps to our energy ministers for approval in the summer. We're going to complete our revised Energy Star specification for April, and we're going to begin those informal consultations with our discussion paper in the spring. So that is where I will leave things for next steps.
Well, thank you, Debbie, and I've got no outstanding questions to address here. So I'll turn it over to Rafa just to wrap things up for us.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Firstly, I'd like to let everyone know that a recording of the webinar will be sent to all the participants, and it will also be available to all of the FenCan members on the resources section of the website. This webinar was originally created for FenCan members only. However, because of the importance of the information that we have made available to our key stakeholders as well. We're committed to ensuring our members are well informed and connected, enabling them to be successful and proactive. So I would also like to take this opportunity to mention to everyone that the association will be holding several events of interest. We hope to see you at our regional event, which is on April 10th in Moncton in New Brunswick. You can register online. If you need a hotel room, you will need to contact the office as the room block is now closed. The Spring Conference and Annual General Meeting will take place June 4th to 6th in Calgary, Alberta. Registration will be online soon. And this December, we'll be holding Windor in Quebec City for the first time. You can visit the website for more details on all the events. The Fenestration Canada membership should expect to receive an email very shortly later today with the information that was referred to in today's webinar, so you can make all of your comments directly. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and have a great day. Thank you very much, Jeff and Debbie.
Thank you. So I'm going to hang up now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks for the time and the invitation.